something we really want to normalize in these efforts is naming what we're not sure about. That is not often part of our cultures in schools. And with this kind of unlearning of ways of teaching math and learning math and thinking about learners that we've all experienced for decades, we have to be okay with being unsure about things and saying those questions out loud to each other. So let's really focus your attention on where am I having a question, because I guarantee other people around you are having similar questions, and I guarantee the folks you work with back in your own context are going to have similar questions too. So we're going to move on, continuing to think about conceptions of learning. And what I really want to emphasize here is how they're implicit. They're often not things we're totally aware of. They're just shaping our actions. And that's because they are coming from all around us. Our institutional messages send them to us, right? If we're held accountable for getting kids to pass a math test that only measures their ability to answer math facts or complete algorithms in certain ways, we're getting institutional messages about what math learning should look like. We also have our own experience as students that really is giving us a script for what math class maybe should look like. And then we have societal messages all around us about math and what math is used for and who can do math. And those show up in everyday interactions, right? How often do you have an interaction where someone says, "Oh, I'm just so bad at math"? It happens around us all the time. We also see it in movies. The representations of math teaching in movies are often pretty typical desks in rows, teacher correcting homework. Not this kind of math that we're starting to envision together. And they also have our past experience as educators. All of these are in our brains, providing us kind of scripts for how to show up in a math classroom or how to think about what it means for students to learn math. And that's where we have to really dig into naming what we want to unlearn and naming what we want to lean into and learn instead. Tracy Zager's book, if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it, Becoming the Math Teacher You Wish You Had. But she talks about this. She says, we watched our teachers demonstrate and explain procedures, some well, some not so well, and tried to replicate those procedures through repetitive exercises. We heard correct answers praised, mistakes criticized. Day after day of worked examples, night after night of computing problems, 1 through 31 odd for homework. We learned what math was. This is how math feels. This is what it means to teach math. This is the script. And then she adds, which is crucial for our transition here to teacher learning and our own learning. No math methods class or single professional development workshop is going to change that script we got from the 18 years as a student. In education research, that's sometimes called the apprenticeship of observation, that we apprenticed into teaching. No other career do you observe someone else doing that job for 18 years on a daily basis before you do it. I think there's a parallel to parenting, but you're observing what it means to be a teacher. You're observing what do you do when a kid has a wrong answer. You're observing what do you do when the kid is really struggling. You're observing what does it mean to make groups in a classroom. Who do you put in groups? When do you have a discussion? What counts as good participation in a discussion? You're observing that for years and years and years. So that takes for us and our teachers a lot of unlearning. And no single professional development is going to change that. So with that, let's dive in. We also have conceptions of teacher learning that are going to shape how we support our teachers to learn. And we're going to focus on teachers here, but everything we say is actually going to apply to any educator. So let's think first about teachers as learners and the assumptions we tend to have about teachers as learners. Let's think again. You'll notice a pattern coming here. Oh, first I want to talk about this, though. Here's why conception of teacher learning is important. It shapes what we spend money on. It shapes how we respond to teacher problems of practice. It shapes what we choose to do and how we choose to enact it in terms of professional learning. It shapes what we prioritize fostering in terms of our school cultures. It shapes how we design and enact our leadership roles. what we assume about teachers as learners, the goals we have for their learning, how learning unfolds and what supports their learning, shape everything we do as we shape the environments around them and the experiences they interact with. This is something we often don't pause to think about. It's often not taught in like principal preparation programs, for instance, but stopping and thinking, what do I actually think it means for teachers to learn is a really crucial step in this work. So we're gonna start with assumptions about teachers as learners. So again, I want you to think for yourself. Think back when you were a teacher or a role similar to a teacher. What did it mean to be a learner in that space? What was your main job in relation to professional learning? What was considered successful or good as you engaged in professional learning? What was considered failure as a professional learner? And what were you considered capable of? And as you feel ready, you can go ahead and share at your tables. Okay, coming back together. Okay. So something to just reflect on for yourself is, as we go through teachers as learners, just notice how does it feel different to think about kids as learners versus my experience as a teacher as a learner. We spend a lot of time in education thinking about kid learning. We actually spend a lot less time really digging into and thinking about teacher learning. So just notice how your brain kind of responds to some of these questions in different ways. Here's an experiment. We talked about these assumptions about students as learners. What I'm curious about, and you're going to talk in your tables in a minute, is all I did was change students to teachers. And what I want you to think about is, do these apply to teachers? How would you revise them or add to them for them to describe how we often think about teachers as learners? Can we use these? Do we need to change them? What does it make us think about? So let's go ahead and take 5 minutes in our groups for that. Okay, I'm going to pause your conversations. And again, let's notice when conversations feel like you could keep going. Write that down so you can keep going another time. There are some really rich examples that surfaced from this conversation that I would love to say whole group. Can you raise your hand if you have a thought that occurred to you or an experience that occurred to you looking at this slide that would be worth saying for everyone here?
I don't know if it's worth for everyone here. Look, I'll share it.
Great.
What caught our attention was should work by themselves. And so as a former teacher and a former principal, I was aware of teachers who just stayed within their room with their kids. They didn't want to venture out. They don't want to talk to anyone. They keep their door shut. And even if they need assistance, they need help, they won't ask for it. And kind of the same with kids. When they have that insecurity that they're going to be viewed as a failure. So just kind of making that same analogy, example.
Others?
I saw someone.
Yeah.
No? She's like, not me. Did you raise your hand? No. Oh, you did? Okay, thanks, Katie. Thought it was-
As former teachers and then people who've transitioned into the role of doing professional learning, we kind of had some ahas when we looked at can be fairly assessed with one performance using one tool and thinking about how we really are sharing those assessments that we do for quality improvement, improvement there being a key word maybe to think about, and then that also relates to have deficits that need to be fixed immediately. So just having some reflection on our own about making sure that our messaging is coming across the way we want it to and not coming across as we're here to tell you what you're doing wrong.
Any others for right now? Okay, we'll have them, we're going to discuss again in a minute, and there'll be another chance to share out. These are important ideas to stay whole group, because if you looked around, everyone was nodding, right? Like, we're all in this together trying to figure this out. But it can be striking how many of these, once we look at them, do shape our thinking about teachers as learners, right? There's such a movement towards scripted curriculum that teachers should just be able to read. They're memorizing an algorithm. They're doing what the textbook, in this case, tells them to do. That there's one way to teach a lesson. And if I can just get you to do that one right way in the right way, then I've successfully supported your learning. There's also, I heard some people talking about needing to be fast and needing to be immediately pick things up after one experience, right? We do that with kids, we do that with teachers. Well, I showed it to you. I went in and modeled that lesson. Why aren't you doing it? Right? We do the same thing. And that's a key idea I want you to walk away with right now. We end up treating teachers as learners the same way we're trying not to teach or treat kids as learners. So we end up in effort to try to tell kids less in math, right? We're trying to support kids' sense making, and we tell teachers how to not tell so much, right? So one of the biggest things we can do, which is really hard, is change and rethink how we're thinking about our design of teacher learning so that it matches with the kind of learning we want our kiddos to have. So that teachers are engaged as learners in the same way that we're trying to engage our kiddos. So with that, look back at your posters now. And it's the same question. If you changed children to teachers, what do you see? Do you need to change any of these ideas? What does that spark for you? If you look at our questions about what we need to assume about learners and what we want learners to think about themselves, what do we think about when we put teachers in there instead? We'll take 5 minutes for that.
affirmed, decision maker, having some autonomy. So it really works into this. Well, and Jody brought up though, in our area, there is some difference. Like some of our community-based partners get paid way lower than our LEAs, who also get lower than our K-12. So we're almost like the A League. Like if we're training
You don't necessarily need to add anything. It's like,
Yeah.
what comes up for you? Did you think you needed to change anything?
No, we actually thought it was very fitting. You know.
Okay, let's wrap up our conversations. Okay. Does anyone feel willing to share an idea or multiple ideas they kept if they changed it to teachers? Ideas that still really resonated if the learners are teachers. Brave soul.
Jill, could you get the front on that side?
Oh,
Just call her out. I'm not going to get there in an expedient amount of time.
Cheerleaders don't normally need microphones. So we kept on our goal for teachers to see themselves as, and we had together successful and imperfect, because you can be successful without being perfect, and that's something that students struggle with, but also we realized a lot of teachers, and we have some NMU professors here, so they were saying teachers going into the field who think they should immediately come in and be perfect.
any other ideas that you kept that seemed really useful in terms of how we want to think about teachers?
When we talked about learners, we talked about them being a community that kind of learns together. And sometimes there's mistakes, and sometimes we help each other out, and sometimes we provide support in that community. And I think that we need to work more at building communities of learners for our teachers.
Anyone else? Oh, way in the back there.
Get you next.
We ironically went through our list and we kept every single one of them. And we felt, that we wanted our teachers to have that playful, capable feeling, to be problem solvers, deep thinkers, social. We had the support from the families and communities for kids. So as we went down every single list, down to the deep thinking and the why and the curious, we kind of thought it was exactly the same.
Last one.
We had a lot of conversation about early learners and early teachers. And we are seeing kids shut down early, and we're seeing teachers shut down early. And so that was the correlation that we kept making. We all kept sharing stories of our first years and what that was like, and then we started thinking about what's happening to our first year teachers right now.
Yes. So as everyone's sharing, this parallel can be really powerful and kind of help us realize some of our implicit ideas or the implicit ideas that are around us in our systems. If you look at your poster, raise your hand if you've been in a school where you felt like that as a teacher. So it's very few hands, right? Raise your hand if you've been in a school where you did not feel like that as a teacher. Maybe you felt like this as a teacher. Much more common, right? So I want to name that this can feel counter-normative, to try to shift school communities to feel like our posters say. It can feel counter-normative, and it's not fixed like this. We're going to get more into that tomorrow. It takes time. But it's crucial, just like building classroom communities is crucial. Okay. I want you to take a moment to think about one assumption you want to try to center going forward as you think about teachers as learners. So maybe one that you're realizing you haven't always held really centrally in your brain when you're thinking about supporting teachers in your context. What's an assumption you want to try to really focus on going forward about teachers and their learning? Go ahead and jot an idea down. And then as always, any questions that are coming up for you. Okay. Now we're going to move on to teachers and goals for their learning and the assumptions and images we have about that. So you're probably noticing a pattern in my method here. I want you to think about PD you experienced as a teacher and try to name, if you can, what you think the goals were for your learning. So you might think about the focus or goal of a session, or maybe you're thinking about evaluative conversations, what the focus or goal of that was. Or if leaders came into your classroom, what did it seem like they were looking for? And what did they celebrate as good teaching? What did it seem like the goals were for your learning? And we're going to place the same lens that we used for kiddos learning, because if you're not noticing already, we're trying to think about kids learning and teacher learning the same way. So think about whether the goals you thought of were about things you should know as a teacher. I need you to know how to teach this lesson. I need you to know how to use this material. I need you to know how to get this kid to learn how to read, whatever it was. Maybe it was doing. Maybe it was a goal for your practice, like you'll be able to lead discussions. We also need to think about goals for teachers in terms of becoming. And this is where I feel like, well, who thought of a goal related to becoming, or feel like they've ever experienced a PD that was about their teacher identity or dispositions? Yeah, that was my experience too. So what we need to do is think about teacher learning again at this intersection, where we think about what do teachers need to know, what do they need to be able to do, and also how do they need to see themselves and their role in relation to mathematics, but broader than that, in relation to learning, the classroom, community, school, and broader society, because schools are part of our broader society. So if we think about that as a lens that we put over the instructional practices, right? This document doesn't say, here's our goals for knowing, doing, and becoming. It lists out practices. We could see that as just goals for doing. But what this tool can help us do, this framework can help us see deeper into the real complexity of the teacher learning that we need to be able to support. So if we think about putting an essential practice at the center of this, we can then think about what knowledge would they need to be able to engage in this practice effectively? And that could be knowledge of early math content. It could be knowledge of how kids learn math. It can also be knowledge of systemic inequities that are commonly reproduced in our classrooms and our instruction. They also need then practices, the doing, that supports children's learning of mathematics content and development of their mathematics identity. They need to know how to, they're doing positive classroom cultures and how to support disruption of systemic inequities in their classrooms. You're noticing that some of these words show up in all three, right? And then in terms of becoming, how do we need teachers to see themselves in relation to children's learning of mathematics content and development of their identities? How do we need to see themselves in relation to systemic equities, to families, to communities, to society? These open up whole new questions about how we're supporting teachers. And it makes it a little overwhelming sometimes because the complexity of a goal becomes a lot more, right? So let's just think about practice number 2. Establish and monitor norms, ways of being in a learning environment with children to develop a classroom culture and climate that promotes positive, robust mathematics identities. So if I just brainstorm, and this is incomplete, right? My teachers would need knowledge of ways in which teachers and classroom communities can either reproduce inequities or disrupt them, right? And how we can either reproduce or disrupt development of positive mathematics identities. I need to know about that. But that's not enough. I also need to know why mathematics identity is important in math content learning. I also need to know the norms that are going to support the learning community. And as we start to overlap with doing, right? These are hard to really separate. It's artificial. I also need to know how to make those norms come alive in my classroom. Knowing them just as a list is one thing, but how do I even make that happen in my classroom is a whole nother thing. I also need to know how to respond to students' ideas in ways that's going to promote and build and foster their identity. But knowing and doing those things is not going to happen if I don't see my role in particular ways. So I also need to see myself as a thoughtful facilitator of my classroom community and the norms that are alive in that classroom. I need to see that as my role. Not something that just happens, but something that I am fostering. And I need to see myself as someone who has a really powerful impact on how my kids see themselves. I need to see my role as really powerful in that way. And a key piece of this becoming too is I actually need to see my role as trying to disrupt the patterns of inequity that I've learned about. So I may have learned about them, I may have learned some ways to disrupt them, but if I don't see my role as that, I'm not going to do it. So what I'm hoping you're seeing is that by putting this knowing, doing, becoming lens on one practice, we start to see the complexity of learning that we need to support teachers to do that's beyond just, I need to get you to establish norms, so here's a piece of paper with some norms, and go establish them, right? This helps us dive deeper and have a lens for looking at what do I need to support my teachers to do, and it helps us see what we maybe wouldn't know what it looks like, and we need to learn more ourselves. And it raises questions for us of how do we support X, Y, or Z. Now I want to emphasize this is incomplete. I could have unpacked this one a lot more, right? This is just an initial stab at it to give you a sense. What you're going to do in your tables now is pick a different essential practice. Or if you really want to, you can pick the same one. I want you to pick one to focus on today. And I want you to try to do what I just did, of dig in deep and say, how would we say how this, enacting this in a really powerful, joyful way, what goals for knowing, doing, and becoming for our teachers do we see within this practice? And I wouldn't worry too much about putting it in exactly the right category. These aren't categories, it's a lens. So put it wherever it seems to fit on your poster, and don't worry too much about if it's knowing, doing, or becoming. It's, are we answering these broader questions? Are we thinking about this full complexity of learning? Okay, I'm going to give you a good 8 to 10 minutes to try to really dig deep into this and try out using this lens of how we see teachers' goals within a practice. Go for it. All right, if we could wrap it up. I just realized my mic's not on. I was up here talking to myself. I'm really sorry to pause those. I think people were getting to a really deep place. Here's what I hope you got a glimpse of. That bringing this lens to an essential practice can help you see the complexity of the learning that you need to support. So my nudge to you would be, as a team, and maybe with a broader team from your context, to figure out time to go through each of the practices in this way to see what you notice about the complexity of the teacher learning that's built into any one of these practices in terms of how we need teachers to see themselves and what they need to be able to do and what they need to know in order to really bring these to life. Oops. What I want to emphasize is that this brings new questions to our minds as we're designing for teacher learning, as we're watching teacher learning unfold, especially by focusing on becoming. So now all of a sudden, our question as we think about teacher learning might be something like, how are we supporting teachers to see themselves as facilitators of sense making rather than deliverers of information? That's a very different goal than how are we getting teachers to lead a discussion? Or we might be asking, how are we supporting teachers to see themselves in relation to fostering productive mathematics identities? That's really different than let's teach teachers about math identity and how important it is. Or maybe it's how are we supporting teachers to see their role in either perpetuating or disrupting the systemic inequities that show up in math classrooms and in math teaching and in math systems. These are really different questions to be asking as leaders of teacher learning than we often ask. Tomorrow we'll get into how they require different ways of supporting teacher learning too. But what I'm hoping you're seeing is that by bringing this lens to looking at the essential practices, we see something really different than if we read it with other lenses. Hopefully it feels like a useful tool. We're going to move on to thinking about how teacher learning unfolds. If you have anything you don't want to lose track of, a new idea you don't want to lose, or a question you're having, definitely jot it down now before we move on. Okay, so now we're going to move on to teachers, and I'm actually going to start using the word educators because I want us to start thinking about teachers and leaders at the same time. And actually, we can apply what we just did to leaders. If you think about your posters, just like we changed children to teachers, we could change teachers to leaders. Interesting exercise. So here's how we often assume that teacher learning or educator learning unfolds. They don't have it. We notice something they're not doing. Then we have some perfect magical lesson, tool, email, conversation, or PD. And then they have it, right? That's how it works. There's a lot of delivery, right? I've been in so many conversations where it's, oh, teachers aren't doing X, Y, Z. Okay, I'll send an email, right? Or, oh, I have the best idea for a PD. Okay, we did that PD. Now they must know it. Moving on to the next thing. This is implicit, and if you start to look for it, you'll see it everywhere. This is implicit in all of our systems, actually, beyond just education. That we think if we just have some magical thing we deliver to people, then all of a sudden they'll have it, and it'll be beautiful. I want to give you a tool that's useful for me, and I found to be useful for other people, for thinking about it in a different way. Instead, what if learning unfolds as a really messy trajectory? And you might at first have some resistance. And then you're going to move through compliance, and then to internalization. Now, let me talk about what some of these can look like. So resistance is more obvious. We've all seen this. We've all seen all of these, actually, is what you'll see. I'm going to resist or oppose some new expectation for my practice. And in my talk, you're going to hear me talking about it as arbitrary. Like, well, that doesn't work, or why would you do that? Or maybe it's constraining, right? I don't have time for that. That doesn't fit into my day. Ineffective, that doesn't work. Unreasonable, right? That's too much for me to take on. Or maybe unattainable, I can't do it. Compliance is when we start to do something, but maybe we still don't really totally get it or why we're doing it, but we are doing it at least the surface level. But there's two things that are key here. I'm doing it because someone told me to. If I had a choice, I wouldn't do it, but someone told me to do it, probably a school leader or someone, right? So now I have to do it. And I still probably see it as a little bit arbitrary and unattainable. Like, why would I do that? I'm doing it to please you, but I don't really get why I'm doing it. And that's different from internalization. This is when I'm really flexible and responsive with something. I can take something new and know when to use it and adapt it for different contexts, and I'm doing it because I believe in it and I believe that it works. It's core to who I think I want to be as a teacher or an educator, and it's core to what I think my work is. So I see it as reasonable, enabling, powerful, negotiable. I can make it my own, and it's within my reach. It's attainable. So we can think about this and what I'm hoping you're seeing is that we see the knowing, doing, becoming in that, right? In internalization, I see it as part of me and who my role is. This is who I want to be in this context. In compliance, it's not yet part of me. It's because someone told me to do it. Okay? So we can think about this with some examples. If you think about kids, right? Sometimes they start doing something just because we showed them to do it, but we realize they don't actually know what they're doing. They're like following what they saw me do. But they couldn't adapt that to a different problem. They can only do it if I give them the same wording of the same problem and the same exact tools, right? They're following what I told them to do. That's really different than the kid who is really flexible in how they're enacting it, right? And knows when to use a certain tool, when they want to use a number line versus when they want to use manipulatives, when they want to use different tools for different things. In my own experience as a teacher, I went to a school that was engaged in a transformation similar to what we're embarking on. And I was told to do math talks. There was a good 3 to 4 month, maybe 6 month period where I was like, I'm doing these math talks. I'm following the script. I have no idea why you're having me do this, right? When am I going to give the kids the worksheet so they'll learn math? If you walked in, you would see me doing a math task. I was doing the math talk. But if you asked me, I would have shown some clear signs that it was not really making sense to me, right? I was doing it because I was told to. There was a shift. I started to see how powerful it was for my kids. I started to see how I could use it in adaptive ways. I started to see it as the most meaningful time I could spend during my math time, right? I stopped doing the worksheets. That was a very different way of me approaching that new expectation. I had internalized it. So I'm imagining you can already think of some examples that you've seen of compliance versus internalization. I want to really dig into what that feels like. So I want you to think about, and this can be in professional learning or otherwise. I think this is true regardless, right? Like think about the first time you learned to drive. You're doing the things because you're remembering that you're supposed to do them, but you don't totally understand why you're doing the different things, right? Or cooking is another great example. So it can be professional or somewhere else in your life. Can you think of an example where you moved from compliance to internalization? I want you to think about how long did it take you? What supported you to make that shift? And how did those two stages feel different? You might also add, what did you need to believe about yourself as a learner to make that shift? Or what did people supporting you need to believe about you as a learner to make that shift? As you feel ready, go ahead and discuss.
How to comply go out and start teaching. I was like, okay, doing it. Follow this activity. Next is it, I would just try with kids and I would do it. Not really, I probably wasn't asking the right questions. I wasn't doing, but I was doing it, right? And then over time, continuing those conversations with my peers and going back and revisiting those activities, doing them again, maybe with another group, later, then I started to, this is why I'm having them reiterate or do whatever they were doing, right? So, yeah.
I think it's harder though to get to the compliance and internalization.
Okay, I'm going to call you back. Okay. So a couple of points I want to make about this, and then we're running out of time. I want to emphasize that compliance is sometimes viewed as a negative thing. What I'm hoping you heard in your examples is that compliance was actually a necessary stage. We have to, in my case, I had to do a bunch of math talks and play with it and see what kids did and see how kids' learning evolved over time for me to start to realize, this is really amazing. This is powerful. Look at what my kids can do. I had to be in the compliance stage. What my leader's work was how to move me through compliance and towards internalization. So compliance can have a negative connotation. It does not in this case. It's a necessary stage for us to move through. We have to try it on. We have to approximate it in order for us to start to realize the power of it and start to realize how to make it our own with our kids in our classrooms. And I chose a bumpy line on purpose because it's also not this every day gets better, right? We know what teaching's like. It goes like this, and then it goes back up, and then the next day it's down again, and then we have 3 weeks of amazing improvement, and then we have a week of awfulness, right? That's what it looks like. So what's challenging for us as leaders of teacher learning is if we're used to thinking about, even if we didn't mean to, thinking about this, and I still catch myself falling into this all the time. We can not notice the ups and downs that our teachers are going on. We either look for, do they have it or do they not have it, right? What this helps us push ourselves to do is start to notice as teachers are learning how they do go up and down, how it's really messy, but we're looking for those signs of, okay, now I see some compliance. Now I see some compliance. That's starting to look a little bit like internalization. I'm going to grab that and keep moving that person forward, right? That becomes our work as leaders, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. But if we think about, go forward here, if we think about this practice that I unpacked earlier, and we thought about the different goals, this is going to unfold along the trajectory. So again, it's not that I can't establish norms and then all of a sudden I can because I got that really cool handout. Or I watched that really good video, right? Or my coach came and helped me once. I'm going to be learning all of this in a really messy way along my messy trajectory, and I'm going to do some of it out of compliance first. And then hopefully, and this is our job to figure out how to support each unique learner we have in our systems, we have to support people to move towards internalization. And one last thing is to think about how this applies to us too. It would be pretty easy, and we've all done it, I've done it, to enact the math essentials in a compliance kind of way and stop there. Right? I made sure everyone was doing math talks. I gave them all manipulatives. I gave them some good PD about having some play. I made a poster of the values. That was really cool, right? We've all seen these efforts to enact new policies. This is a policy. We've seen efforts to enact new visions that are compliance. And probably because of how new this vision is for a lot of us, it's going to feel like compliance at first, and we have to be okay with that. And we have to think about how do we support each other to move towards internalizing what it means to bring these math essentials to life in our classrooms. We are also on this trajectory somewhere. Okay. We're going to dig into all that more tomorrow in terms of how to support folks along that trajectory. Go ahead, because we're going to take a break in a minute. If there's something you're like, oh, this is simmering in my head and I want to make sure I don't forget it, write it down. And if you have any final questions that are simmering, write them down. And because we have to transition, I'm going to keep you here. Thank you. We're going to go to break in a minute, so you have plenty of time to talk then. Okay. Okay. I mean, it's great when things feel like we have to talk about them right away. Again, we're going to dive into this more tomorrow. Thank you so much for diving so deeply with me today. I hope it felt useful. I hope it feels like it scratched the surface of some conversations that you can continue to have more deeply in your teams. And I'm going to hand it over to Trish.
Thank you, Alison. I really appreciate the powerful message of the process. We are doing some really deep thinking, and this thinking is really messy, and we're not looking for perfection at this point. I just wrote down that compliance is a necessary stage. And we need to think about that, right? We need to think about that. It's a space that we're all going to be in at some point, but this isn't perfection. We're going to make mistakes. Rusty and I have made a few mistakes along the way. But we're going to get there together because we are better together.